History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 7 The End of the Europeans' World. Chapter 2 The Era of the First World War. The cost of this huge conflict has never been adequately computed. One figure, which is approximate, indicates its scale. About 10 million men had died as a result of direct military action. Yet, typhus probably killed another million in the Balkans alone. Nor do even these horrible figures indicate the physical cost in maiming, blinding, or the loss to families of fathers and husbands, the spiritual havoc in the destruction of ideals, confidence, and goodwill. Europeans looked at their huge cemeteries and were appalled at what they had done. The economic damage was immense, too. Over much of Europe, people starved. A year after the war, manufacturing output was still nearly a quarter below that of 1914. Russia's was only 20% of what it had then been. Transport was in some countries almost impossible to procure. Moreover, all the complicated, fragile machinery of international exchange was smashed, and some of it could never be replaced. At the center of this chaos lay, exhausted, a Germany which had been the economic dynamo of the Central Europe. We are at the dead season of our fortunes, wrote J. M. Keynes, a young British economist at the peace conference. Our power of feeling or caring beyond the immediate question of our own material well being is temporarily eclipsed. We have been moved beyond endurance and need rest. Never in the lifetime of men now living has the universal element in the soul of man burnt so dimly. Delegates to a peace conference began to assemble at the end of 1918. It was once the fashion to emphasize their failures, but perspective and the recognition of the magnitude of their tasks impose a certain respect for what they did. It was the greatest settlement since 1815, and its authors had to reconcile great expectations with stubborn facts. The power to make the crucial decisions was remarkably concentrated. The British and French prime ministers and the American president, Woodrow Wilson, dominated the negotiations. These took place between the victors. The defeated Germans were subsequently presented with their terms. In the diverging interests of France, aware above all of the appalling danger of any third repetition of German aggression, and of the Anglo Saxon nations, conscious of standing in no such peril, lay the central problem of European security, but many others surrounded and obscured it. The peace settlement had to be a world settlement. It not only dealt with territories outside Europe, as earlier great settlements had done, but many non European voices were heard in its making. Of 27 states whose representatives signed the main treaty, a majority, 17, lay in other continents. The United States was the greatest of these. With Japan, Great Britain, France, and Italy, she formed the group described as the principal victorious powers. For a world settlement, nevertheless, it was ominous that no representative attended from Russia, the only great power with both European and Asian frontiers. Technically, the peace settlement consisted of a group of distinct treaties made not only with Germany but with Bulgaria, Turkey, and the succession states which claimed the divided dual monarchy. Of these, a resurrected Poland, an enlarged Serbia called the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, and later Yugoslavia, and an entirely new Czechoslovakia were present at the conference as allies, while a much reduced Hungary and the Germanic heart of the old Austria were treated as defeated enemies with whom peace had to be made. All of this posed difficult problems, but the main concern of the peace conference was the settlement with Germany embodied in the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919. This was a punitive settlement and explicitly stated that the Germans were responsible for the outbreak of war. But most of the harshest terms arose not from this moral guilt but from the French wish, if possible, so to tie Germany down that any third German war was inconceivable. This was the purpose of economic reparations, which were the most unsatisfactory part of the settlement. They angered Germans and made acceptance of defeat even harder. Moreover, they were economic nonsense. Nor was the penalizing of Germany supported by arrangements to ensure that Germany might not one day try to reverse the decision by force of arms, and this angered the French. Germany's territorial losses, it went without saying, included Alsace and Lorraine, but were otherwise greatest in the east to Poland. In the west, the French did not get much more reassurance than an undertaking that the German Bank of the Rhine should be demilitarized. The second leading characteristic of the peace was its attempt, where possible, to follow the principles of self determination and nationality. In many places, this merely meant recognizing existing facts. Poland and Czechoslovakia were already in existence as states before the peace conference met, and Yugoslavia was built around the core of the former Serbia. By the end of 1918, therefore, these principles had already triumphed over much of the area occupied by the old dual monarchy and were soon to do so also in the former Baltic provinces of Russia. After outlasting even the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs were gone at last, and in their place appeared states which, though not uninterruptedly, were to survive most of the rest of the century. The principle of self determination was also followed in providing that certain frontier zones should have their destiny settled by plebiscite. Unfortunately, the principle of nationality could not always be applied. Geographical, historical, cultural, and economic realities cut across it. When it prevailed over them, as in the destruction of the Danube's economic unity, the results could be bad. When it did not, they could be just as bad because of the aggrieved feelings left behind. Eastern and Central Europe was studded with national minorities embedded resentfully in nations to which they felt no allegiance. A third of Poland's population did not speak Polish. More than a third of Czechoslovakia's consisted of minorities of Poles, Russians, Germans, Magyars, and Ruthens. An enlarged Romania now contained over 1 million Magyars. In some places, the infringement of the principle was felt with especial acuteness as an injustice. Germans resented the existence of a corridor connecting Poland with the sea across German lands. Italy was disappointed of Adriatic spoils held out to her by her allies when they had needed her help. And the Irish had still not got home rule after all. The most obvious non European question concerned the disposition of the German colonies. Here, there was an important innovation. Undisguised colonial greed was not acceptable to the United States. Instead, tutelage for non European peoples formerly under German or Turkish rule was provided by the device of trusteeship. Mandates were given to the victorious powers, though the United States declined any, by a new League of Nations to administer these territories while they were prepared for self government. It was the most imaginative idea to emerge from the settlement, even though it was used to drape with respectability the last major conquests of European imperialism. The League of Nations owed much to the enthusiasm of the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who ensured its covenant, its constitution, pride of place as the first part of the peace treaty. It was the one instance in which the settlement transcended the idea of nationalism. Even the British Empire had been represented as individual units, one of which significantly was India. It also transcended that of Europe. It is another sign of the new era that 26 of the original 42 members of the League were countries outside Europe. Unfortunately, because of domestic politics, Wilson had not taken into account the United States was not among them. This was the most fatal of several grave weaknesses which made it impossible for the League to satisfy the expectations it had aroused. Perhaps these were all unrealizable in principle, given the actual state of world political forces. Nonetheless, the League was to have its successes in handling matters which might, without its intervention, have proved dangerous. If exaggerated hopes had been entertained that it might do more, it does not mean it was not a practical as well as a great and imaginative idea. Russia was absent from the League just as she was from the peace conference. Probably the latter was the more important. The political arrangements to shape the next stage of European history were entered into without consulting her, though in the Eastern Europe this meant the drawing of boundaries in which any Russian government was bound to be vitally interested. It was true that the Bolshevik leaders did all they could to provide excuses for excluding them. They envenomed the relations with the major powers by revolutionary propaganda, for they were convinced that the capitalist countries were determined to overthrow them. The British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, and Wilson were in fact more flexible, even sympathetic, than many of their colleagues and electors in dealing with Russia. Their French colleague, Clemenceau, on the other hand, was passionately anti Bolshevik and had the support of many French ex soldiers and investors in being so. Versailles was the first great European peace to be made by powers all the time aware of the dangers of disappointing democratic electorates. But however the responsibility is allocated, the outcome was that Russia, the European power, which had potentially the greatest weight of all in the affairs of the continent, was not consulted in the making of a new Europe. Though for the time being virtually out of action, it was bound eventually to join the ranks of those who wished to revive the settlement or overthrow it. It only made it worse that rulers detested the social system it was meant to protect. Huge hopes had been entertained of this settlement. They were often unrealistic, yet, in spite of its manifest failures, the peace has been over-condemned, for it had many good points. When it failed, it was for reasons which were for the most part beyond the control of the men who made it. In the first place, the days of a European world hegemony in the narrow political sense were over. The peace treaties of 1919 could do little to secure the future beyond Europe. The old imperial policemen were now too weakened to do their job inside Europe, let alone outside. Some had disappeared altogether. In the end, the United States has been needed to ensure Germany's defeat, but now she plunged into a period of artificial isolation. Nor did Russia wish to be involved in the continent's stabilizing. The isolationism of the one power and the sterilization of the other by ideology left Europe to its own inadequate devices. When no revolution broke out in Europe, the Russians turned in on themselves. When Americans were given the chance by Wilson to be involved in Europe's peacemaking, they refused it. Both decisions are comprehensible, but their combined effect was to preserve an illusion of European autonomy which was no longer a reality and could no longer be an adequate framework for handling its problems. Finally, the settlement's gravest immediate weakness lay in the economic fragility of the new structures it presupposed. Here, its terms were more in question. Self determination often made nonsense of economics, but it is difficult to see on what grounds self determination could have been set aside. Ireland's problems were still with us 80 years after an independent Irish Free State appeared in 1922. The situation was all the more unlikely to prove unstable because many illusions persisted in Europe and many new ones arose. Allied victory and the rhetoric of peacemaking made many think that there had been a great triumph of liberalism and democracy. Four autocratic, anti national, illiberal empires had collapsed, after all, and to this day, the peace settlement retains the distinction of being the only one in history made by great powers, of which were democracies. Liberal optimism also drew strength from the ostentatious stance taken by Wilson during the war. He had done all he could to make it clear that he saw the participation of the United States as essentially different in kind from that of the other allies. Being governed, he reiterated, by high minded ideals and a belief that the world could be made safe for democracy if other nations would give up their bad old ways. Some thought that he had been shown to be right. The new states, above all, the new Germany, adopted liberal parliamentary constitutions and often republican ones too. Finally, there was the illusion of the League, the dream of a new international authority which was not an empire, seemed at last a reality. Yet all this was rooted in fallacy and false premise. Since the peacemakers had been obliged to do much more than enthrone liberal principles, they had also to pay debts, protect vested interests, and take account of intractable facts. Those principles had been much muddied in practice. Above all, they had left much unsatisfied nationalism about and had created new and fierce nationalist resentments in Germany. Perhaps this could be helped, but it was a soil in which things other than liberalism could grow. Further, the democratic institutions of the new states and the old ones, too, for that matter, were being launched on a world whose economic structure was terribly damaged. Everywhere, poverty, hardship, and unemployment exacerbated political struggle, and in many places they were made worse by the special dislocations produced by respect for national sovereignty. The crumbling of the old economic patterns of exchange in war made it much more difficult to deal with problems like peasant poverty and unemployment too. Russia, once the granary of much of the Western Europe, was now inaccessible economically. This was a background which revolutionaries could exploit. The communists were happy and ready to do this, for they believed that history had cast them for this role, and soon their efforts were reinforced in some countries by another radical phenomenon, fascism. Communism threatened the new Europe in two ways. Internally, each country soon had a revolutionary communist party. They affected little that was posited but caused great alarm. They also did much to prevent the emergence of strong progressive parties. This was because of the circumstances of their birth. Comintern, or Third International, was devised by the Russians in March 1919 to provide leadership for the international socialist movement, which might otherwise, they feared, rally again to the old leaders whose lack of revolutionary zeal they blamed for a failure to exploit the opportunities of war. The test of socialist movements for Lenin was adherence to the Comintern, whose principles were deliberately rigid, disciplined, and uncompromising, in accordance with his new view of the needs of an effective revolutionary party. In almost every country, this divided socialists into two camps. Some adhered to the Comintern and took the name communist. Others, though sometimes claiming still to be Marxists, remained in the rump national parties and movements. They competed for working class support and fought one another bitterly. The new revolutionary threat on the left was all the more alarming to many Europeans because there were so many revolutionary possibilities for communists to exploit. The most conspicuous led to the installation of a Bolshevik government in Hungary, but more startling perhaps were attempted communist coups in Germany, some briefly successful. The German situation was especially ironical for the government of the new republic, which emerged there in the aftermath of the defeat, was dominated by socialists who were forced back to reliance upon conservative forces, notably the professional soldiers of the old army, in order to prevent revolution. This happened even before the founding of the Comintern, and it gave a special bitterness to the divisions of the left in Germany. But everywhere, communist policy made united resistance to conservatism more difficult, frightening moderates with revolutionary rhetoric and conspiracy. In Eastern Europe, the social threat was often seen also as a Russian threat. The Comintern was manipulated as an instrument of Soviet foreign policy by the Bolshevik leaders. This was justifiable given their assumption that the future of the world revolution depended upon the preservation of the first socialist state as a citadel of the international working class. In the early years of civil war and slow consolidation of Bolshevik power in Russia, that belief led to the deliberate incitement of dissatisfaction abroad in order to preoccupy capitalist governments. But in the Eastern and Central Europe, there was more to it than this, because the actual territorial settlement of that area was in doubt long after the Versailles Treaty. The First World War did not end there until in March 1921. A peace treaty between Russia and the new Polish Republic provided frontiers lasting until 1939. Poland was the most anti Russian by tradition, the most anti Bolshevik by religion, as well as the largest and most ambitious of the new nations. But all of them felt threatened by a recovery of Russian power, especially now that it was tied up with the threat of social revolution. This connection helped to turn many of these states before 1939 to dictatorial or military governments which would at least guarantee a strong anti communist line. Fear of communist revolution in Eastern and Central Europe was most evident in the immediate post war years, when economic collapse and uncertainty about the outcome of the Polish Russian War, which at one time appeared to threaten Warsaw itself, provided the background. In 1921, with peace at last and symbolically the establishment of orderly official relations between the USSR and Great Britain, there was a noticeable relaxation. This was connected with the Russian government's own sense of emerging from a period of acute danger in the Civil War. It did not produce much in the way of better diplomatic manners and revolutionary propaganda, and denunciation of capitalist countries did not cease. But the Bolsheviks could now turn to the rebuilding of their own shattered land. In 1921, Russian pig iron production was about one-fifth of its 1913 level. That of coal, a tiny 3% or so, while the railways had less than half as many locomotives in service as at the start of the war. Livestock had declined by over a quarter, and cereal deliveries were less than two-fifths of those in 1916. Onto this impoverished economy, there fell in 1921 a drought in South Russia. More than 2 million died in the subsequent famine, and even cannibalism was reported. Liberalization of the economy brought about a turnaround. By 1927, both industrial and agricultural production were nearly back to pre war levels. The regime in these years was undergoing great uncertainty in its leadership. This had already been apparent before Lenin died in 1924, but the removal of a man whose acknowledged ascendancy had kept forces within it in balance opened a period of evolution and debate in the Bolshevik leadership. It was not about the centralized autocratic nature of the regime which had emerged from the 1917 revolution, for none of the protagonists considered that political liberation was conceivable or that the use of secret police and the party's dictatorship could be dispensed with in a world of hostile capitalist states. But they could disagree about economic policy and tactics, and personal rivalry sometimes gave extra edge to this. Broadly speaking, two viewpoints emerged. One emphasized that the revolution depended on goodwill and the mass of Russians, the peasants. They had first been allowed to take the land, then antagonized by attempts to feed the cities at their expense, then conciliated again by the liberalization of the economy and what was known as NEP, the New Economic Policy, which Lenin had approved as an expedient. Under it, the peasants had been able to make profits for themselves and had begun to grow more food and to sell it to the cities. The other viewpoint showed the same facts in a longer perspective. To conciliate the peasants would slow down industrialization, which Russia needed to survive in a hostile world. The party's proper course, argued those who took this view, was to rely upon the revolutionary militants of the cities and to exploit the still non Bolshevized peasants in their interest, while pressing on with industrialization and the promotion of revolution abroad. The communist leader Trotsky took this view. What happened was roughly that he was shouldered aside, but his view prevailed. From the intricate politics of the party, there emerged eventually the ascendancy of a member of its bureaucracy, Joseph Stalin, a man far less attractive intellectually than either Lenin or Trotsky, equally ruthless and of greater historical importance. Gradually, arming himself with a power which he used against former colleagues and old Bolsheviks as willingly as against his enemies, he carried out the real Russian Revolution to which the Bolshevik seizure of power had opened the way and created a new elite on which a new Russia was to be based. For him, industrialization was paramount. The road to it lay through finding a way of forcing the peasant to pay for it by supplying the grain he would rather have eaten if not offered a good profit. Two 5 year plans carried out an industrialization program from 1928 onwards, and their roots lay in the collectivization of agriculture. The Communist Party now, for the first time, conquered the countryside. In a new civil war, millions of peasants were killed or transported, and grain levies brought back famine. But the towns were fed, though the police apparatus kept consumption down to the minimum. There was a fall in real wages, but by 1937, 80% of Russian industrial output came from plant built since 1928. Russia was again a great power, and the effects of this alone would assure Stalin a place in history. The price in suffering was enormous. The enforcement of collectivization was only made possible by brutality on a scale far greater than anything seen under the Tsars, and it made Russia a totalitarian state far more effective than the old autocracy had been. Stalin, though himself a Georgian, looks a very Russian figure, a despot whose ruthless use of power is anticipated by an Ivan the Terrible or a Peter the Great. He was also a somewhat paradoxical claimant to Marxist orthodoxy, which taught that the economic structure of society determined its politics. Stalin precisely inverted this. He demonstrated that if the will to use political power was there, the economic substructure could be revolutionized by force.